For decades, these cases haunted investigators, tormented families, and kept communities on edge. Killers walked free, victims went unidentified, and justice seemed like a distant dream. Then, something changed. DNA technology advanced, and genetic geology emerged. Cold case units got new tools and fresh eyes. Cases that sat dormant for decades are finally getting answers. Serial killers who thought they'd escaped are being dragged from their quiet retirements. John and Jane Does are getting their names back, and families who'd given up hope are finally getting closure. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 bone-chilling cold cases that were just solved. 25. The Golden State Killer. Joseph DeAngelo terrorized California throughout the 70s and 80s, committing at least 13 murders, 50 and over 100 burglaries. He taunted victims and police, called women years after assaulting them, and seemingly vanished in 1986. For decades, he was a ghost. It wasn't until 2018 when the investigators uploaded DNA evidence to GED Match, a public genealogy database, that they found distant relatives, built a family tree, and identified DeAngelo as a former police officer living quietly in Sacramento. He was 72 years old and had been hiding in plain sight for over 3 decades. His arrest marked the dawn of genetic geology in law enforcement. 24. The original Night Stalker murders connected after 40 years. Before Joseph DeAngelo was identified, the crimes attributed to the original Night Stalker and East Area were thought to be separate cases. However, DNA evidence finally linked them in 2001, but the killer remained unknown for another 17 years. The connection was crucial. It transformed a series of seemingly random attacks across California into a discernible pattern. When DeAngelo was caught, investigators realized they'd been hunting the same man under different names for 4 decades. The case showed how siloed investigations can let serial criminals slip through the cracks. 23. The Bear Brook murders. In 1985 and 2000, 4 bodies were found in barrels in Bear Brook State Park, New Hampshire, a woman and 3 girls. Their identities were unknown, and no one came forward to claim them either. So they sat in evidence for decades, nameless. In 2019, genetic genealogy identified the woman as Marilyse Honeychurch and 2 of the children as her daughters. The 3rd child was determined to be the killer's daughter from another relationship. The killer, Terry Peter Rasmussen, was already dead too, but he was posthumously linked to additional murders across the country, revealing him as a likely serial killer. 22. Lori Erica Ruff. Lori Erica Ruff died in 2010, left her family with a disturbing discovery that she wasn't who she claimed to be. Her identity had been stolen from a deceased 2-year-old in 1988. Before that, no one knew who she was. She'd erased her past completely. After years of investigation, genetic genealogy identified her in 2016 as Kimberly McLean from Pennsylvania. She had run away at 18 and disappeared into a new identity. However, the mystery wasn't a crime. It was simply a woman fleeing a troubled past who became one of the most famous identity cases in American history. 21. The Colonial Parkway murders. Between 1986 and 1989, 8 people were killed along Virginia's Colonial Parkway in a series of attacks that appeared connected but couldn't be solved. The victims were couples attacked in parked cars, and the killer left little evidence each time. In 2023, DNA evidence finally linked the cases definitively and pointed to a suspect who had died in 2017. The frustration for families is immense, as the killer escaped justice by dying before technology could catch up, but at least they now know who terrorized the Parkway. 20. The Bible John killings. Glasgow was terrorized in the late 60s by a killer who met women at the Barlin Ballroom and murdered 3 of them. He quoted the Bible to his victims, earning the nickname Bible John, and the case went cold for over 50 years. Recent DNA analysis has provided new investigative leads, though the case remains technically unsolved. What's changed is that surviving evidence has been reprocessed with modern techniques, and investigators believe they may finally be close to identifying one of Scotland's most infamous unknown killers. 19. The Candy Lady poisoning. In 1974, Timothy O'Brien died after eating a cyanide-laced pixie stick on Halloween. His father, Ronald Clark O'Brien, was convicted of the murder after it emerged he'd taken out insurance policies on his children shortly before the killing. What's recently been discovered, however, is that O'Brien may have had an accomplice who was never charged. Cold case detectives have been re-examining evidence, and new witness testimony suggests that at least one other person knew about the plan. The case that defined stranger danger may have been even darker than originally believed. 18. The Claremont serial killings. From 1996 to 1997, 3 young women vanished from Claremont, Australia, and no one was charged for it for over 20 years. In 2020, however, Bradley Robert Edwards was convicted based on DNA evidence that had matched through familial searching. What stunned investigators during the trial was evidence suggesting Edwards wasn't the only predator operating in the area at the time. The investigation remains partially open, with detectives examining whether at least 2 other individuals may have committed similar crimes that were mistakenly attributed to a single killer. 17. Buckskin Girl. In 1981, a young woman's body was found in Ohio. She wore a distinctive buckskin jacket, leading to the nickname Buckskin Girl. Despite extensive efforts, she remained unidentified for 37 years, until she was finally identified in 2018 as Marsha King, 21, who had left home in Arkansas in 1980. The DNA Doe Project used genetic genealogy to identify. Turns out her family had filed a missing persons report, but no one ever connected the dots. Her case demonstrated how the unidentified victim database and missing persons database often fail to communicate, leaving families in limbo. 16. The Monster of Florence. Between 1968 and 1985, another serial killer terrorized couples, but this time in the Italian countryside surrounding Florence. The killer, labeled as the Monster, claimed at least 16 victims, and despite multiple arrests, no one was ever definitively proven to be the killer. In 2023, Italian investigators announced they had identified the killer through new forensic analysis, though the suspect had died years earlier. The case had been complicated by alleged satanic cult connections, corrupted evidence, and wrongful accusations. Good thing advanced DNA techniques cut through the chaos. 15. Princess Doe. A teenage girl's body was found in a New Jersey cemetery in 1982. She was brutally murdered and remained unidentified, despite the authorities spending decades on publicity and facial reconstruction. No one came forward to claim her, so she ultimately became known only as Princess Doe. Genetic genealogy finally revealed her identity in 2022 as a 17-year-old runaway from New York. Her suspected killer had actually been identified in 2018, but had died in prison in 2000 while serving time for an unrelated murder. He had never been charged with her death, and she had been missing from another jurisdiction, so the two systems never connected. 14. The Lady of the Dunes. Found in 1974 in the dunes of Provincetown, Massachusetts, this woman's brutal murder became one of New England's most notorious cold cases. Rumored connections to organized crime and even film productions couldn't lead to her identification. Then, in 2022, the FBI announced she had been identified as Ruth Marie Terry. More shockingly, she was connected to a convicted murderer named Guy Rockwell Moldavan, who had been interviewed during the original investigation but never arrested. He died in 2002, but Ruth finally has her name back. 13. Somerton Man. One of the most baffling mysteries of the 20th century began in 1948, when an unidentified man was found dead on Somerton Beach in Adelaide, Australia. His dental records matched no one, his clothes had their tags removed, and a code found in his pocket was never broken. For 75 years, he was a mystery. In 2022, DNA testing revealed he was Carl Webb, an electrical engineer from Melbourne, but his death appeared to have been from a heart failure and not murder, as long suspected. The code in his pocket? Likely just initials from a memory game. The world's most mysterious John Doe turned out to be an ordinary man who simply died far from home. 12. The West Mesa Bone Collector. In the desert outside Albuquerque, authorities uncovered the remains of 11 women in 2009. Surprisingly, all were connected to the city's troubled street community. Yet, despite identifying most victims, police still couldn't identify the killer. Recent genetic genealogy work has been narrowing the suspect pool, with investigators now focusing on a small number of individuals. Several victims have been connected to the same person through DNA evidence found at the scene, which suggests that a single serial killer might be behind it all, rather than multiple perpetrators. 11. The Delphi Murders. Abby Williams and Libby German were both just in their teenage years when they were murdered while hiking in Delphi, Indiana in 2017. In their final moments, Libby was able to capture video and audio of the suspect on her phone, which police released. However, the case remained cold for 5 years despite having millions of tips. Turns out the guy behind it all had actually been interviewed early in the investigation, but was somehow overlooked. In 2022, the public was shocked to learn that Richard Allen, a local man who had worked at a pharmacy in town, was arrested for the girl's murder. The case shows how even with direct evidence, human error can let killers slip away. 10. The Boy in the Box. In 1957, a young boy's body was found in a cardboard box in Philadelphia. Despite being one of the most investigated cold cases in history, he remained unidentified for 65 years. Literally, generations of detectives have tried and failed. When the case was finally solved, the truth shocked investigators. In 2022, genetic genealogy finally identified him as Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a boy with a childhood marked by abuse and neglect. But what makes it more unsettling is the fact that some family members were reportedly still alive and had kept the secret for decades. 9. The Keddie Cabin Murders. In a remote cabin in Keddie, California, 4 people were brutally murdered in 1981. The brutality of the murders and the isolated location created the case that seemed impossible to solve. 2 suspects were identified but never charged, and both have since died. Decades of improperly stored evidence have finally paid off, with recent DNA testing having produced new forensic breakthroughs, confirming the identity of at least one killer. While a conviction may be out of reach, investigators are now digging deeper to uncover who else may have been involved. 8. The Freeway Phantom. Between 1971 and 1972, 6 young black girls were abducted and murdered in the Washington, D.C. area. The killer, dubbed the Freeway Phantom, left notes taunting police, and despite an extensive investigation, no one was ever arrested. When a genetic genealogy was done in 2021, the case pointed to a suspect who had been a person of interest decades earlier, but was never charged. The case has since become a stark example of how crimes against marginalized communities often receive less attention and fewer investigative resources. 7. The Idaho Student Murders. One of the most shocking crimes in recent Idaho history unfolded in November 2022. When 4 University of Ohio students were stabbed to death in their home. Despite no forced entry and no apparent motive, the case initially seemed random and unsolvable. However, within just weeks of undergoing genetic genealogy, DNA found on a sheath matched Brian Koberger, who is a PhD criminology student at a nearby university. His arrest demonstrated how quickly modern techniques can work when properly applied. The speed shocked even seasoned investigators, who were used to cold cases taking years or decades. 6. The Long Island Serial Killer. Over a span of 15 years from 1996 to 2011, at least 10 people were murdered and had their remains discarded along Gilgo Beach on Long Island. Most of the victims were women in vulnerable situations, and the killer proved both prolific and meticulous in covering their tracks. Just like the earlier suspects, Rex Howerman lived a normal life as an architect living in the nearby area until he was arrested in 2023. He had been living with his family all along, just less than a mile from where some victims were found, and detectives had interviewed him years earlier without pursuing charges. DNA evidence and cell phone data linked him to multiple victims, proving that sometimes the person responsible isn't far away. We just have to know where to look. 5. The original Zodiac Cipher. The Zodiac killer terrorized Northern California in the late 60s, killing at least 5 people and sending taunting letters and ciphers to newspapers. His identity remained unknown, and his cryptograms went unsolved for over 50 years. Until a team of codebreakers finally cracked it in 2020. The message was characteristically taunting, claiming the killer wasn't scared and loved collecting slaves. While the Zodiac's identity remains officially unsolved, the cipher breakthrough has provided new investigative angles. 4. April Tinsley. In 1988, 8-year-old April Tinsley was abducted and murdered in Fort Wayne, Indiana. The killer left taunting messages on barn doors over the years and even sent used condoms to random homes, daring police to catch him. For more than 3 decades, John Miller, a 59-year-old man, had eluded authorities, but in 2018, Genealogy finally caught up with him. The very trophies he had sent provided the DNA that would ultimately expose him. His capture proved that no matter how long someone hides, evidence has a way of catching up. 3. The killer who attended his victim's memorial. After a Valentine's dance in Fort Worth, Texas, Carla Walker was abducted and murdered, and for 46 years, her killer remained free. But he didn't just escape, he stayed involved. Glenn McCurley, arrested in 2020 at the age of 77, had attended memorial services for Carla multiple times over the decades. Witnesses reported the man who seemed out of place at these events, but no one connected him to the crime. When genetic genealogy identified him, investigators discovered he'd been hiding in plain sight, revisiting his crime while pretending to mourn. 2. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann. In 2007, 3-year-old Madeleine McCann vanished from a vacation resort in Portugal, sparking one of the largest missing person investigations in history. For over a decade, investigators chased leads across multiple countries without identifying a prime suspect. In 2020, German prosecutors identified Christian Bruckner, a convicted offender who was in the area at the time, as their main suspect. While no charges have been filed as of this recording, investigators have stated they believe Madeleine is dead and that they have evidence linking Bruckner to her disappearance. The case that defined an era of missing children coverage may finally be approaching resolution. 1. The BTK Killer. Dennis Rader terrorized Kansas for 17 years, killing 10 people and giving himself the name BTK, or Bind, Kill. He taunted police with letters and packages, and went silent for decades. When he resurfaced in 2004 to continue his taunts, it led to his downfall. Rader asked the police if a floppy disk could be traced. They told him no, then traced metadata on the disk he sent directly to his church computer. The Christ Lutheran Church file led to his arrest in 2005. The case demonstrated that even the most careful criminals make mistakes, especially when their egos demand attention. Right now, Rader is serving 10 consecutive life sentences. And there you have it, 25 bone-chilling cold cases that were just solved. Every one of these seemed impossible at some point. Families were told to give up hope. Investigators ran out of leads. Killers lived free for decades. But technology caught up. New eyes saw old evidence, and justice, delayed though it was, finally arrived. If this video gave you hope that the truth eventually comes out, hit that subscribe button and notification bell for more stories of mysteries solved. And if you want to keep watching, check out 25 missing person cases that haunt the police. Remember, no case stays cold forever.